Hello and welcome to another episode of Dark Souls Dissected. Today's episode is all about Seek Guidance, a miracle you can cast to find more messages. It has both online and offline functionality, and while a lot of players have a general understanding of its purpose, its exact inner workings, and some of the things it reveals, is something I've been meaning to talk about for a while. And it was honestly at its coolest in Dark Souls 1 in particular, so we get to see an older idea of theirs that's mostly had diminishing efforts since. I should also mention that in preparing for this episode, we discovered a few things that have gone unnoticed this whole time. It's pretty neat that new discoveries are still being made here, and I'm looking forward to sharing them. So what does Seek Guidance do, exactly? It unmasks hidden developer messages, and later in the video, I'm going to review all of them. There's some pretty funny and weird stuff in there. It also retrieves more player messages if you're online, and it also reveals the breakdown of their positive and negative ratings. That's right, whenever you normally read a message without Seek Guidance, that's just the total number of votes it has. Those aren't upvotes, nor are they a net positive total. Until you realize this, it's easy to be misled about a message's reliability. Like maybe you thought the whole community had to be in on this troll, but you can use Seek Guidance to get a better read on what everyone actually thinks of it. The way Seek Guidance pulls more messages from online is pretty interesting too, because it does so without invoking any kind of network activity. At this moment, the game isn't actually contacting the server and asking for more messages. Instead, whenever you receive a message from another player online, your game will randomly decide if it's hidden or not. Seek Guidance simply unmasks messages your game has already received, ones that are simply hidden by default. This behavior is not an innate characteristic of the message itself, and as far as we can tell, it has nothing to do with its performance. It's just a random decision your game makes as the recipient. A message that might be invisible to you can be visible by default to someone else. Behind the scenes, they're treated exactly the same as hidden developer messages too. I mean, they are different, in that actual player messages proliferate online and they can be voted on, etc. But when it comes to how they're unmasked, they're dumped into the exact same menu in debug. A solid white circle here is a message that we've received and it will be visible by default. An empty circle is one that requires Seek Guidance to be seen, and we'll watch it temporarily turn into a solid white circle when we bring it into view. And this right here could be a hidden developer message, or it could be an actual hidden player message. They're all cataloged in the same space here. In Dark Souls 1, the purpose of Seek Guidance can be summarized as, it helps you see the vote breakdown of messages. Or at least, I think that's the only valid reason someone might want to carry it. Generally, most players will probably consider a waste of an attunement slot. Don't get me wrong, the developer messages are cool to find, so if you're into the novelty of trying to interact with this obscure part of the game, knock yourself out. But there's a reason this isn't, like, a widely recommended thing to do. No one is telling new players to use Seek Guidance. But there are some genuinely helpful tips, so what's the problem? The two main problems here are its duration and effect radius. Each cast lasts only 30 seconds. That might sound like enough to work with, but we need to consider who the system was intended for. New players. Players to whom these sorts of tips might still be revelatory or helpful in some way. When you're learning a new level, 30 seconds can be gone in an instant. Fighting just one enemy could easily eat up an entire cast, and then you didn't get to cover enough ground to actually find any messages. So you might be thinking, don't waste a cast while you're fighting enemies, but the need to do that is why it kind of sucks. If the idea is that you're supposed to clear an area out before you start combing it for hidden messages, this means you're going to be exploring these areas with such a fine-toothed comb that Seek Guidance just becomes redundant. The messages are often harder to find than the things they're talking about, after all. To fix this, I think Seek Guidance should have been something that could be running while you just play the game normally, giving you more organic opportunities to reasonably find this stuff. Frequently refreshing your Seek Guidance casts at a bonfire, just so you can do this? This is playing the game wrong. I think a drastic change, so that it ran for something like a full 4 or 5 minutes per cast, would put it back in a place where people might actually recommend it. The other issue is its effect radius. You have to get pretty close to hidden messages in order to see them. In some bottlenecked paths, this isn't such a big deal, but there are places where it's incredibly easy to miss them. I don't think the developers intended for you to not be able to see this message until you're literally standing on top of it. It just doesn't feel that well playtested. But for all of its shortcomings, the hidden developer messages are still neat. and its implementation in Dark Souls 1 remains the most fascinating to me. Dark Souls 2 unquestionably improved its desirability as a utility, because for that game, they marked every single illusory wall with a hidden message, without exception. The consistency means you can actually trust it to help find secrets, so there's always a much more immediate payoff in finding them. They also increased its number of uses to start with 10 at the lowest, and they quadrupled its duration so that it lasts 2 minutes. Additionally, you can see the messages from much further away. So just like I was proposing for Dark Souls 1, finding hidden messages while playing normally was a lot more realistic here. However, my gripe with Dark Souls 2 is how that's all they did with it. There aren't any kind of tips or observations about weird stuff in the environment. It's purely like a metal detector for illusory walls, and there's zero customization. Every message always says the exact same thing. That's kind of boring. The messages don't really have any personality when they're all exact clones. You might be excited to find another illusory wall, but you definitely don't care what the message itself says. Also, one feature that's lost here is showing the positive and negative voting breakdown, but that's because Dark Souls 2 is the odd one out. It doesn't allow negative votes in the first place. In Dark Souls 3, appreciate them trying to bring back the magic of Dark Souls 1 a bit, but I do have some notes. Let's start with the good. The messages are again customized and specific to various things. They also added some redundancy. For example, there's a tip telling you to use the Storm Ruler against Yorm. This message is found both outside the boss room and inside by the weapon itself. I can think of a few places where having multiple copies of the same message would have been appreciated in Dark Souls 1. And the really cool part? Seek Guidance also helps you find more summon signs in Dark Souls 3. While I haven't researched this at a deeper level, I'm going to hypothesize that, just like in Dark Souls 1, they probably implemented this without Seek Guidance contacting the server or sending out any packets or whatever. It allows you to see summon signs while you're unembered. Normally you have to be embered to see them, so what the game is likely doing is simply unmasking signs your game is already receiving, just like the hidden messages. It's a clever twist on what this miracle offers, and being able to be aware of player summon signs, even when you can't immediately use them, is actually a great idea. It's something I wish these games did more often, because it might be what convinces someone who normally shies away from online activity to consider going human or embered, due to the assurance that they're actually going to find summon signs right away. Just like Dark Souls 2, this offers a clear and tangible improvement over how it was used in Dark Souls 1. So what's my problem with it here? There's only 8 hidden developer messages. Technically there's more if you count the redundant copies, but that's still only 8 unique messages, compared to the 31 that Dark Souls 1 has. Despite Dark Souls 3 being the bigger game, Dark Souls 1 has almost 4 times the amount of messages. Once again, this is a genuine problem for their discoverability. You're going to be rewarded for your search efforts far less often. Now, compared to Dark Souls 1, they did increase the cast duration from 30 seconds up to 60 seconds. This, combined with the message redundancy, means they were thinking a little bit about trying to make some messages easier to find. But its 60-second timer is only half as long as what Dark Souls 2 offered, so it's like they forgot some of their own lessons in making it decent. To make matters worse, it fails to show the vote breakdown of online messages, so that's something else where they seem to have forgotten about its previous design. There is also no way to see the vote breakdown in games like Bloodborne and Elden Ring. You can see the breakdown of your own messages, but not that of others, because it is just the overall total once again. It's honestly really weird that these other games haven't gone back to how Dark Souls 2 handles it. Or, if you're not going to change how that works, then you should have something that maintains the previous functionality of Seek Guidance. I don't think this is a carefully considered system in their more recent titles. I believe it's only this way because that's how they made it for Dark Souls 1. And now we have a situation where you could previously get more information on a message like this, but now you can't in Elden Ring. That's pretty lame. It feels like a step backwards. An oversight caused by copying over online systems from previous games, without tailoring them to each individual game as best as they could. In the end, I think the design of Seek Guidance evolved with the understanding that the network features would be heavily utilized by most of the player base, so the need for developer messages waned. But this is not a satisfying trajectory to me. I like the idea of having a miracle that helps simulate the online experience while you're fully offline, plus seeing what the developers have to say can be interesting. Both Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3 brought objective improvements to Seek Guidance, but they also scaled back the scope of the hidden developer messages. The most ideal version to me would be one that has lots of unique messages like Dark Souls 1, one that more consistently also points out illusory walls like in Dark Souls 2, and one that helps you find more summon signs like Dark Souls 3. Put them all together, and we'd easily have the best version of Seek Guidance yet, but as it stands, it's always a bit lacking in each implementation. As I mentioned earlier, there's a total of 31 developer messages hidden throughout Lordran. Though the system might have fallen a bit short in its goal to provide hints for newer players, it turns into an Easter egg hunt for the rest of us. Number 1. In the Undead Asylum, we'll find a one-word message saying "Exchange" over by Snuggly's trading nest. Don't see it? Yeah. For some reason it's back here.
Give me.
We're already off to a really bad start if these were supposed to be helpful in some way, because we have to go past Snuggly's nest to even find it. Maybe the message is like a form of encouragement to engage with the system if you have any doubts, but Snuggly's dialogue already makes it very clear that they want something, so that doesn't make a lot of sense. Maybe you're thinking, does this help from some other angle of approach? And the answer is no. We're already running into an example of where the small effect radius doesn't even allow us to see it from here. It doesn't come into view until we start sliding off. So in terms of usefulness, I'm giving this message a 0 out of 10. It's virtually impossible to not find out about Snuggly first without the message. Can you think of anything in the entire game that's more pointless than this? I can't. But in terms of Easter egg vibes, I'm going to give it a bunch of bonus points. We're starting off with a very strong 9 out of 10. It's stupid how hard it would be to find this, and it's definitely not where a player would put it. It feels like the developer who placed it here just wasn't even taking the system seriously. Its terrible placement makes it interesting. Number 2. When we drop off from the Undead Parish elevator onto this landing, we can find a message that tells us path ahead. This one's a mixed bag for me, because you've sort of already found the path. But still, some players might not realize what the intended path forward is, especially if they never found the chests below. They might mistakenly think the purpose of this area is to get down there. So the message could serve as further encouragement to keep looking for another path up here. Number 3. That's not all that's over here. We have another one right down here on the next step of the path, proclaiming, "Here." Just like the one in the Undead Asylum, we're unable to see it from above. The devs probably didn't intend for you to have to stand on it directly though, so this feels pretty rough. But with its placement seeming more logical and well-intentioned, it's not as funny to me as the Undead Asylum one, so it's not getting any bonus Easter egg points either. Number 4. We have one more message in Firelink Shrine. This one is found on the underside of the aqueduct, telling us imminent merchant, to help inform us that Donal of Zena will be here later. This one is kind of funny to me because it's only helpful if it's not currently relevant. It's impossible to not see him first if he's already here, so in order for this to be helpful, you'll need to find this earlier and remember to check back later. Number 5. In the Undead Burg, we have a message telling us jumping off ahead by these breakable barrels. They're trying to encourage exploration and help us find loot in these side paths. It's maybe not as helpful as marking this doorway below would have been. The one thing down here a lot more players actually miss, but the intention here was good. Number 6. Right at the start of the Hellgate Bridge, there's a message saying imminent Drake. The placement of it seems carefully considered. It's right over the boundary that causes it to spawn, but stopping to read the message can save you, albeit with some comedic timing. I think the biggest obstacle here is when players don't notice the stairway in this nook on the right. Pointing that out probably would have been more helpful, since everyone is going to find the Drake regardless. Warning you after you've already triggered its spawning feels a bit like this.
Ow! My tongue!
What's up?
But theoretically, someone could find this message if they're trying to figure out what's up with this locked door, so it feels somewhat plausible that someone might be able to find it. Number 7. Down in the lower Undead Burg, there's a message saying prisoner ahead, over by Griggs of Vinheim. It's not that helpful since he already makes it very apparent that he's locked inside. I guess you could make the mistake of not walking close enough to the door to hear his dialogue, but that seems very unlikely.
Somebody, please let me out of here.
I at least want to give this some credit for being placed in a logical area. Most of the previous messages would require total luck to find if you're not purposefully covering every square inch of the map. But a player who is actually looking for guidance might think to check for messages by locked doors, so this is among the most reasonably discoverable. Unfortunately, it doesn't do anything to help you find the key if you didn't find the merchant. Or even worse, maybe you did find the merchant, but didn't even realize he sold keys, because you expected the game to work like other video games.
So, more tabs, people said. I can't believe I didn't see that. You know what I'm used to? I'm used to the default tab of a game being the All tab.
So, yeah, it could have made an attempt to steer players towards the solution. I know some people will think that spelling things out is too handholdy, but even if it said something incredibly direct, like need key, try merchant, I wouldn't have a problem with that. You should be rewarded for finding some of these messages in the first place, but instead it simply tells us that there's a prisoner here, something we were going to find on our own. Number 8. In the Undead Parish, Blacksmith ahead marks the start of the path towards Andre. I consider this one pretty good. It's possibly the most mundane thing to comment on so far, but a lot of new players can feel pretty overwhelmed here. Most people doing blind playthroughs won't figure out how to get past Hellkite, meaning they have to go past these hollows and rats every time they try progressing through the parish. By the time they get to the church, they can be pretty stressed and not sure where to go. I've seen players choose the shortcut back to Firelink Shrine and the stairs leading up to the gargoyles first, resulting in an unfortunate gameplay loop where they keep attempting the gargoyles without upgrading their weapon. Something to help signpost the purpose of this path is pretty thoughtful, and it's the closest match to an actual message real players will leave so far. Number 9. Up in the church, we have another prisoner ahead message, at the start of the path leading towards Lautrec. This one is very useless. It would have been far more helpful to have a message telling you that he's untrustworthy or dangerous in some way. In terms of telling you that he's down this hallway, not only is this the most obvious hidden path in any Souls game, but even if you somehow never find him, he's going to break out of here on his own anyways. Number 10. At the very beginning of the Darkroot Garden, there's a message saying, "Follow the shining flowers." I love this stupid message, though I don't think it's all that helpful. One does help mark the entrance to the Darkroot Basin. Another chain of them later shows the path of least resistance to the Moonlight Butterfly, and another pair of them sort of help point you towards Sif, I guess. But there are massive gaps between these sets of flowers, so I don't know that they adequately lead you through the area. And you probably want to thoroughly explore anyways, and deviate from the main path, so I'm not sure what the suggestion that you stay close to them really provides. It could be that the developers had originally planned on this area being easier to get lost in, perhaps something akin to the Forbidden Woods of Bloodborne, where lanterns were a lot more helpful for finding and navigating the main path. We might be seeing a sort of half-baked area concept here, but I still think this message is cool. It brings attention to an environmental detail in a way none of the previous messages have, and the wording of it really stands out. Normal messages don't use the syntax or have these word options. It stands out enough that it's always the first hidden developer message I think of anytime the subject comes up. It'll probably be used in the thumbnail for this video. I'm also reminded of the original Dark Souls trailer. The first time we got to see any of these environments, they included a few tracking shots, but it's only the Darkroot Garden that has the camera moving forward. It's really the only logical camera movement if you decide to record in this particular space, but I can't help but feel that they had this sort of forward motion towards the flowers in mind. There's an unused cutscene of this promo shot that still remains in the game's files, but it was polished a bit and had shaky camera movements added, instead of the steady cam that the trailer had. Number 11. Darkroot Garden continues to drop all pretense with the format of its messages, and has another one down here asking, "Are the trees moving?" This is meant to bring attention to one of the weirdest enemies in the game, these giant trees. One of them serves as an obstacle to the path to the Wolf Ring, but this message is placed in the area between the two trees. So what could this possibly help with if you've already found your way down here? You've already figured out that you can kill them or get around them. Unless maybe you got here by falling down? It is a survivable fall, but the second tree down here doesn't exactly block the path, so I just really don't know what they were thinking with the placement of this. It would have made a lot more sense if this was placed before the one that actually blocks the path. But this is all assuming the point of the message is to even help us get past them in the first place. You want to know something weird? It might not be. What if, more broadly, it simply wants us to ask, are the trees moving? At first, I figured this had to be intended to bring your attention to their subtle movements, like how the roots flex and twitch like their fingers or toes, to help identify them as a creature that can be attacked. But have you ever noticed one of these spinning around before? I assume that most players who've played the game multiple times have noticed the second tree move or spin a little bit, but it turns out it patrols between two specific points that happen to be pretty close to each other. It's not just some weird idling animation or bug, this is intentional behavior given to it. If you crank up its animation speed, you can more easily see what that patrol path looks like. However, it is an enemy that's aware of your presence, and it doesn't like being seen. So if you get too close, it stops moving, making this behavior harder to notice. Now, you might be thinking, the first tree doesn't do anything like this, right? Because it's actually competent at blocking its path. But actually, it does. It's not on a constant patrol by default, but instead, when you go into the Moonlight Butterfly's arena, an event is triggered that gives it a new home position, where it then tries to block the path you came in from. So if you return after the boss without using Homeward Bone, you can watch it move to its new spot. Just don't get too close to it. It doesn't even successfully block the path, though, that's too wide. So it's not something you need to kill to get back to the bonfire, but it seems to want to trap you in here. This is incredibly weird and unnecessary. This is a behavior that most players will never notice, and even if they do, it's very unlikely that they'll grasp the full picture of it. So it turns out, are the trees moving is actually a very good question. It highlights what might be the most obscure behavior of any enemy from any Souls game. Even the flaming poop attack is a lot more recognized. I'm giving this my first full 10 for Easter egg vibes. Credit to King Boar for teaching me about the tree's behavior. I'll link to his video about this in the video description. Number 12. We have one more in the Darkroot Garden that says Ember ahead, pointing to the enchanted ember by the mushroom parents. This is also among the most useless messages, because finding the chest on your own isn't hard at all. While finding this message, when we remember the 30-second effect time, with a limited number of casts and fairly small effect radius, you'd have to really go out of your way to cover every square inch of the Darkroot Garden in order to find this. It's not even on an obvious angle of approach, and it's placed where the chest is already in view. But I am going to give this one full points for Easter egg vibes as well. It's certainly not talking about anything as interesting as the last couple messages, but it deserves all the bonus points it can get for being the most elusive. This was the last hidden developer message to be discovered. How do I know this? It's because I might be the person who discovered it. Maybe. Before I take all the credit, let's take a trip down memory lane and review what the hunt for these messages looked like. When the game had been out for a little over a year, it dawned on me that we might not know about all of them. In reviewing the list of all the ones known on Wikispaces at the time, I managed to find one that was missed in Firelink Shrine. And this motivated me to become more organized in my search, where I consulted a text dump of the game to see what all of the possible messages could even be. And within a day I discovered most of the rest. And while I can see that I am the first person to document these and add them all to the wiki, I was surely talking to people like Demon's Lantern at the time, who did the data mining for me. And I can see in the revision history that this last one was missed for several months. I definitely checked near every ember in the game, but it managed to evade me on my first couple searches. I honestly can't remember if someone I was working with found it first and told me about it, or if I just found it after a repeated attempt. If it was the former, I apologize for not remembering. It's been a long time. Now, regardless if I found this on my own or not, I think this helps make the case for my pitch on why the cast time should have been much longer. To put this into perspective, it took me 6 casts again to find it just now. I could have looked at the picture on the wiki to remind myself of its exact placement, but I wanted to recapture that experience of trying to find it again. Even already knowing it was somewhere near this chest, I still found myself walking around for several minutes before it finally popped up. Now, just imagine a normal player, and not like someone who previously added this to the wiki. There's just no way to thoroughly cover all of the ground of the Darkroot Garden, even with several copies of Seek Guidance. The idea of a random player finding this naturally on their own is downright ludicrous. I have to wonder if that's ever happened. Number 13. Over in the Valley of Drakes, we have this one pointing out the red tearstone ring. I think this is among a few messages where the idea was that maybe you wouldn't have had too hard of a time finding the thing it's talking about, but rather, you already know there must be something ahead, and you're just not sure if it's worth the trouble. That would explain the previous entry a little bit. It doesn't make much sense in execution. The mushroom parents are slow-moving enemies that are very easy to maneuver around, but if you really wanted to know what was over there without getting closer, I guess this almost helps. I could see how it makes a little more sense for this message in the Valley of Drakes, assuming you would even think to cast Seek Guidance here, which, to beat a dead horse, doesn't seem very likely. I do think it's interesting that this is the only ring pointed out by a hidden developer message. It's worth considering that maybe the developers knew this was going to be an in-demand ring, and that could be why it has some elevated importance. The Red Tearstone Ring of Dark Souls is a recreation of the Clever Rats ring from Demon Souls, after all. While it's not the majority of the player base who benefits from such a high-risk, high-reward kind of ring, those who like them tend to love them, and the developers would have already known this coming from Demon Souls. Number 14. In the depths, we have this incredible message saying, "I can't take this." They knew a lot of players were going to get cursed, so it's like the game is taking a moment to bask in its own cruelty by pretending to commiserate with you. And we should also bear in mind that the original, unpatched version of the game allowed for curses to stack, which was ridiculously brutal. You could be cursed a total of 3 times, to have your health capped at 1/8. Yeah, half health suddenly doesn't sound so bad, does it? This message doesn't offer any helpful advice, of course. It just takes on the personality of another player who is suffering with you, which is pretty awesome. It's the only developer message like this. Number 15. Next up we have Try Sliding Down. This one also kind of rules. Behind the giant rat, we have this ramp that slides below. But a lot of players don't realize that if you hug the wall on the far left, it drops you off here instead of down into the hallway below. Now, it's really not a long walk from the hallway up to where the slide would have dropped you off, but it spares you from a small ambush of rats and a basilisk. And Kirk if you're in human form. It's not that challenging of an area, but you can see what the developers were trying to spare you from. I'm sure that was the main intent, but I think more importantly, it's just very satisfying to have this optimized, efficient path for navigating through the depths. Drop down behind the butcher, pick up the key to the bonfire, and then use this totally sick slide. Now you're ready to open both the shortcut to the boss and the bonfire room with very little effort. There's a few hidden messages that acknowledge the shortcuts they put into their levels, and it's cool to see. Speaking of which, number 16. Imminent shortcut marks the ladder on the shortcut path back to the boss. I've seen a decent number of blind playthroughs where the player doesn't find this, so the path to the Gaping Dragon winds up being a lot more arduous than it should. If players realize there's a shortcut to be found in the first place, they might understand they should do some more exploring before taking on the boss, making the level a lot easier. Number 17. Weakness. Head. Relatable. This is one of a couple messages found inside a boss room. The idea of someone being overwhelmed and running around looking for tips during a fight is pretty funny and hard to imagine. But nonetheless, here's one encouraging you to hit the Gaping Dragon on his little crocodile head. There is a whole mechanic for body part damage multipliers, and the Gaping Dragon does take 50% bonus damage there. But I don't think this is a very helpful tip. For anyone having trouble with this fight, the best advice would be to steer clear of the Gaping Dragon's attacks, and to run in for hits when it's safe, which generally means not hanging out by its face. Plus, there's probably another body part you should be focusing on: its tail. Removing it makes the fight a lot less dangerous, and it might teach you about the existence of tail weapons. So in my opinion, it's sort of a waste of a message, tipping us off to the wrong body part, even if it is a weak spot. But there is some novelty here. The depths is the only area to have 4 hidden developer messages, so it has the most. And if you remember from my video on Gravelording, it also has the most Gravelord Black Phantoms. So to me, the depths feels like the king of having weird extra stuff. Number 18. Path ahead. In Upper Blighttown, they knew some players would get lost in the side loop that's behind us, and simply wanted to clarify the main path forward. There's really nothing else to say, beyond that maybe mentioning to look for torches could have been a more helpful tip for marking paths. Just like follow the shining flowers, but instead, follow the torching torches? Number 19. Bug? Overlooking the parasitic wall hugger, we have this hilarious message that simply asks, Bug. Even the developers thought this guy was a total weirdo. What even is he anyways? Well, there's all sorts of speculation that this might be the final stage of whatever is also growing on Jeremiah's head. To recap this lore speculation rabbit hole, its name in the data is Prince Isolus, already creating an alluring connection to pyromancers. And it is found right above a corpse carrying a pyromancy that happens to reference a specific pyromancer by name, Carmina. There are different kinds of transformations and mutations happening to people in this area. It's not just Quelaag and her sister. For example, even the crag spiders used to be people. So this being something that grew off of someone else seems reasonable at least. The word parasite is literally in its name. You can even make the case that it has a very similar shape to the growth on Jeremiah's head, and concept art for Jeremiah shows more detail than we get to see in-game, including what might be the start of some tendrils poking through. So yeah, maybe Carmina, or someone else like Salaman, went through the same thing that Jeremiah is currently going through, but this is its final stage, like it popped off its body and left the remaining portion of its human corpse below. Whether that's canon or not doesn't really matter. Along with the message that asks, are the trees moving, this is one of a couple messages that wants us to stop and ponder what the hell we're looking at. Even if it wasn't intentional, what we can speculate on is really interesting. Number 20. Illusory wall ahead. In Quelaag's domain, we have a message trying to help point this out. This feels a bit more plausible that someone might actually find this, since someone might be wondering what's up with the circle on the floor, and we're not far from a bonfire, which means easily refilling our casts if they're out. While this is the only hidden message pointing out an illusory wall in Dark Souls 1, it's a preview of what the system turned into for Dark Souls 2. Number 21. Try Divine. Here we have a very well-intentioned message found in the Catacombs, one suggesting that you try using divine weapons to have an easier time with the skeletons. My biggest complaint is that it shows up in the first wider space you have as you enter this level, making it more missable than if it was found on a bottlenecked path. I think what we saw in Dark Souls 3 was a reaction to this. If we had another Tridivine also down by the bonfire, or maybe one on the outcrop out here too, I don't think anyone would complain if there was a bit of redundancy to make it easier to find. This criticism will be relevant later in the video when I get to the new things we discovered. Number 22. Liar. This one is short and to the point. It's warning us that patches can't be trusted.
You're a bald-faced liar.
Okay, please.
A fucking liar.
But just like the message over by Donal of Zena, this message isn't conditional to patches actually being here. So depending on how you progress, it is possible to find this message without patches around. Number 23. Blacksmith ahead. Outside the entrance to Vamos, we find a message assuring us of his existence. I find this a bit interesting because it doesn't help you find out how to open the entrance to his area. A message up top might have been more helpful, but at least it might encourage you to explore. Number 24. Need curses. In New London Ruins, we have a message telling us need curses, a pretty straightforward recommendation on how to deal with the ghosts. The message is found close to a few transient curses, and it's also on a narrow path where it should be easier to find. Number 25. Imminent jumping off. I talked about this in my last video, which explored the prototype design of New London Ruins. Outside the second ghost house, we have a drop-down path that makes getting to the Four Kings a lot easier. And we can see this was an intended shortcut, marked with this message. There's a decent number of players who won't realize you can drop safely from here, and when combined with the shortcut ladder earlier in the level, this means there's a path to the boss where they wanted you to be able to get by without having to fight any enemies. I understand that the lack of a bonfire in New London Ruins is a point of frustration for a lot of players, but this shortcut route was purposefully made this way to help compensate for that. Even though the message was just trying to be helpful, I'm going to give it some bonus points for Easter egg vibes, since there's still a lot of players who don't know about this, and it's an interesting reflection on the level's design. Number 26. Need Covenant. Within the entrance to the Four Kings, we have a message saying Need Covenant. I find this one a little funny because the wording shows some restraint, or at least it looks that way. Maybe it's just a slightly awkward translation, but if we take the wording at face value in English, it feels like they still wanted you to puzzle it out in some way. Because a message saying Need Ring would have put you on the right track more quickly. Of course, Covenant is in the name of the needed item. They're obviously talking about the Covenant of Artorias. But since actual covenants are completely unrelated, I can see how the wording of this might confuse some players until they realize they're talking about the ring. Number 27. Prisoner ahead. In Sense Fortress, there's a message by the breakable wall leading to Logan. While it's a friendly tip to have, it's the only hidden developer message in the entire level. I can think of several other spots where they could have been included as well. Perhaps most importantly by the bonfire, and also one that could have said something like key required to help point out the shortcut that so many players miss. I think they might have overestimated the amount of players coming from Demon Souls, who'd be more likely to recognize this as an elevator.
Are you here to fight the demons?
Anyways, if you want to get to Logan, there's a bunch more ways to break open this wall than just aiming the boulder at it. If you haven't seen my video about breakable objects yet, give that a watch because it examines every possible method. Trust me, there are some weird ones. I'm not talking about just using the snake. Number 28. Path ahead. Over by the buttress leading to the broken window, we have a message telling us how to proceed in Anor Londo. It's pretty self-explanatory, and once again feels like a completely normal message that actual players are likely to leave. Number 29. Try Projectile. Here's another one I find fascinating. I know some of you are going to interpret this to have innuendo, but the developers wanted to convince some players to destroy her illusion and plunge Anor Londo into darkness. The placement of this message is interesting. With it off to the side, they made it harder to find on purpose. Number 30. Safe Zone ahead. We have only one message in all of the Demon Ruins in Lost Izalith. It's of course meant to help you find a safer place to fight the Centipede Demon instead of just hugging the Fog Gate. But the problem is that they placed it after this first gap in the lava, meaning anyone who made it this far wasn't going to have any trouble finding the safe zone. You can already even see an item from here. So this was entirely pointless, and I guarantee that this has helped no one ever. Number 31. Try Resignation. So this one is pretty wild. Inside the first Seath encounter, we have this message here. Being an unwinnable encounter that progresses you to the next part of the game, you might be wondering why they even bothered with this message. They're telling players to give up and die, who were going to die regardless, right? Well, this just happens to be the one boss room where you can walk right back out through the Fog Gate. How many players have actually noticed this on their own? Not that many, I'm sure, but with there being an option to leave, that likely inspired this message that tries convincing you to stay. I know some people instinctively turn around after going through Fog Gates. It's a sort of, I hope I'm not walking into a boss room sort of move. So at least a few players out there have found the exit. But even if you figure out that you can walk back out, that doesn't mean that you're already going to know that it's an unwinnable encounter. Like, you're still going to assume you need to defeat the boss to progress further. So the idea of someone thinking, what do I do here? As they repeatedly exit the room just seems completely absurd. On top of that, the idea of someone walking into this room and immediately thinking, oh man, I should cast Seek Guidance, that's nonsense as well. Okay, that wraps up all of the hidden messages. While I can promise that I didn't really miss any, we do have some new discoveries here. How does that make any sense? Well, let's finally get into it. While I was scripting this episode, I noticed that YouTuber Libralonix also recently made a video sharing the locations of the hidden messages, and in it he issued a sort of challenge.
10 years ago, Reddit user Retro Game Audio searched through the dialogue text dump that was provided on the Dark Souls wiki, and they found 2 additional hidden messages that have never been found in the game. They are Try Light and Try Lightning. My challenge to you, and to all of the Dark Souls community, is to find these 2 hidden messages.
Well, I've got good news. We found them. And the funny thing is that we've gone full circle here. That Retro Game Audio Reddit user he mentioned, that was me, before I created Illusory Wall. To explain why we gave up looking for these a long time ago, I should explain why I was convinced that they were unused content. Earlier, I showed how we can see all the hidden messages listed out in debug. I double-checked what all of these actually were to make sure we weren't missing any, and I found no more than the 31 messages we already knew about. This means Try Light and Try Lightning were definitely unused content, because they would have to show up in here. So, case closed, right?
Wrong.
When preparing for this episode, I just really wanted some extra assurance about these messages. I thought maybe we could at least learn something about the maps they were intended to be in. Like perhaps they'd be numbered or grouped in some way that offer some clarification. Asked Hot Pocket Remix to take a look, and I'm very glad I sought his expertise, because he quickly found something I missed. Here's what he had to say. The DLC has a bunch of patch param files that are intended to add on the DLC's content. Those can also patch existing messages. And the interesting thing is they replaced those unused messages. Today, the Catacombs has several non-hidden messages that weren't in the game in its original unpatched release on console. These are the messages that are meant to help you find your way back out of the Catacombs if you get stuck in the Tomb of the Giants early on. I always knew that these messages weren't in the game originally, but I didn't have the context that the game actually overwrote the unused messages in order to include them. The key takeaway here from Hot Pocket Remix's discovery is that maybe they could have existed at an earlier time. And I'm glad I followed through on double-checking this, despite our initial skepticism, because that's exactly what happened. Fire up the unpatched vanilla version on PS3 or Xbox 360, and you should be able to go find these. A better term for them would perhaps be removed content. Try Light is exactly where everyone guessed it would be, right at the start of Tomb of the Giants. Special thanks to Samuel Diamond for taking a look for me and gathering all the unpatched footage for this video. When we remember that one of the newer messages is nearby over here, it really elucidates the process behind altering this message. They basically just did a drag and drop to over here, changed what it said, and made it so that it wasn't hidden. At this point, King Boar joined Samuel to help look for Try Lightning, because the location of that was less obvious. One early guess was that maybe it was an error. There is Try Divine right at the start of the level, so like maybe they just input the wrong infusion? It would make a lot of sense to remove a mistake like that, because otherwise, where the hell in the Catacombs would they have recommended Lightning? Pinwheel. The answer is seriously Pinwheel? Yeah, so I guess he's weak to lightning, apparently. It does stand out as his lowest resistance if you take the time to look up the data on that, but goddamn if that isn't the funniest outcome for a message I've been wondering about for over 10 years. There are places in the game where players will make use of the gold pine resins found in the Undead Berg, which do help a lot, so I was thinking more along those lines. But instead, the message was originally trying to offer help on the boss that no one was asking for help with, and that no one ever made lightning recommendations on. The interesting angle to this is that Pinwheel's room does have a pool of water in it, and while most of the clones in Tomb of the Giants are outside of the water, one is down there, and there's at least one other who's likely to wind up there as well. Now, you don't actually have to hit the enemy while they're standing in water to get the lower resistance. They didn't make a dynamic effect for that, the damage is the same regardless. But it still shows an environmental consideration that the developers had in mind, one that failed to translate in a meaningful way to player tactics. They wanted the presence of water to make you consider using lightning on Pinwheel, but no one really bothers because it wound up being extremely easy. And while this lower lightning defense is baked into Pinwheel's stats, the water itself can still serve a purpose. There's a somewhat lesser known area of effect caused by throwing lightning bolts into water, which will radiate out in a circle of damage. Bearing in mind that the clones are one-hit kills, they probably not only considered lower lightning defense for Pinwheel, but also the strategy of being able to clear several at once by aiming at the ground. Something that could also be helpful in that other pool of water too. There was almost a good idea here, but it fell apart. So, more than a decade later, I can finally put the mystery of these messages to rest. But that's not all. Earlier in the video, I talked about how the redundancy of a few messages in Dark Souls 3 would have been welcome here too, and the first thing that honestly came to mind was Try Divine. I don't know how to prove the timeline of these events, but I wrote most of this episode's script before we found these. Right here, I suggested this specific outcrop as a spot that would have been good to have a second copy of that message. Leading right up to the same spot, they did originally have a duplicate, directly addressing my concern about being in too spacious of an area. While we were really only on the hunt for 2 removed messages, the fact that the catacombs had 3 messages patched into it should have informed us that there'd be another, and this is the culprit. It's funny to see how I was completely on the same wavelength as one of the developers. It feels extremely vindicating. But why did they get rid of these? I think there's likely a combination of things. It's clear that sometime after launch, the developers understood the lack of value in the hidden developer messages. Almost no one was finding these, and rather than trying to buff Seek Guidance, it seems that they were happy to just kind of let it go. The DLC areas didn't bother including any. It does have several non-hidden messages, ones that really feel like they would have been hidden if they were in the game at launch. So hidden messages were on their way out, something they stopped caring about, and there was a much more pressing issue in the catacombs. Players getting stuck in Tomb of the Giants before having the ability to warp. You can't make it back out, you're not going to get soft locked down there. A lot of people either don't find the path back out of the Tomb of the Giants, or they encounter one of the turned bridges and don't know about the escape path that gets them to the top of the catacombs. These issues are far bigger challenges than knowing that Pinwheel is, weak to lightning? I know I keep saying this, but I can't stress it enough. The boss fight is so easy that most players don't even comprehend that it has a second phase. Did you know it has a second phase? Tri-Light maybe felt a little too obvious, and their only duplicate message, which, while I would argue might have been a better placement for it, to be fair, it was found after the first Necromancer, so I could also see it feeling less necessary there to some developers. They weren't wrong to say, maybe the game doesn't need these. I'm also assuming it wouldn't have been hard to just add completely new messages from scratch, but who knows if something weird behind the scenes discouraged that. The Crystal Cave also had some alterations. Just like the modified messages in the catacombs, this area also has 2 non-hidden messages that weren't in the game originally. I have mixed feelings about these. Players getting completely stuck here because of the invisible bridges used to be a much bigger concern, but by making them permanently visible, they also ruined your chance to discover them. There's no way to not see this now, so it feels like they walked back the area's concept almost entirely. Unlike the messages in the catacombs, this doesn't give us any old hidden messages to discover, because while they were hidden initially, they said the same things. They didn't overwrite anything this time, but they did move them, and where they used to be made a lot less sense. To recap where they are currently, we have Path Ahead, spoiling the first major walkway needed to progress through the area. And secondly, we have this other message saying Imminent Fall, letting you know that it's safe to drop down there. But the original version of Path Ahead was where the Imminent Fall message is now. The first main walkway had no hidden messages on it at all, so without having one here, it feels pretty pointless to mark later paths if the player was already able to discover this area's gimmick on their own. As for Imminent Fall, that was originally placed on the invisible path that leads you down to the dead end with the blue Titanite chunk. It's a path that a lot of players will first discover as a route back out of there, having dropped down from above. Its placement was far enough out, roughly by the Prism Stone seen here, that you also weren't going to be able to find it by casting Seek Guidance on solid ground. And Imminent Fall made sense for a message that we drop down to, and can also drop down from. So what the heck is this one even talking about? It'd be incredibly funny if it was actually meant to warn you about the upcoming, horrendously slippery level geometry. I have no idea, of course, but that's the only possible thing I can think of. Either way, Path Ahead in its current placement would have made a lot more sense as a hidden message. The placement was definitely improved when it was patched, but it's the default visibility I find questionable. Thank you so much for watching. Soon I'll be launching a second channel for more casual content. It's probably poor form to share it before anything is even up over there, but I didn't want to wait on getting this video out, so I'll just go ahead and announce it for anyone who wants to keep an eye on it. It's going to be called Illusory Plays, and the URL is linked in the video description. I'd like to thank again Hot Pocket Remix, Samuel Diamond, and King Boar for helping solve the mystery of the removed messages. If you'd like to support this channel, please consider subscribing, liking, or leaving a comment. All that stuff really does make a big difference. You can also support me on Patreon, that's patreon.com/illusorywall. And also an extra special thanks to all of my backers at the Evil Vagrant tier. Basileus, Europa, Gary Marshall, Hug-Sized, Insearable, Jack Gerhardt, Kakaruma, Carl Germ, Kiko Abad, Chris, Lazy Tangent, Nashwan Azari, Nate Hines, Ronax, The Majalis Duo, and Zelther. See you all next time.